Okay, welcome back to Unit 4, and this is the Art Historical lecture for Unit 4, in which we're going to cover a very, very long time period, the transition from the late Roman, early Christian period all the way through to the late Gothic. So it's a very, very long, and a lot of things happened, a lot of changes in artwork. There's a ton of artwork to look at, but, you know, we're just going to go through it very on a quick overview and primarily just concentrate on the changes that we see in churches, in the structure of cathedrals and churches, the basilica form. And so, and also this is actually the second art historical lecture for Unit 4 because we did start with a very brief review of Roman art and architecture. Because, why did we do that? Oh yeah, because I had one thing that I had left unsaid when it came to the lecture on representation, so I use that as a chance to just do a very kind of cursory look at Roman art and architecture. So what is the point of this lecture? Well, it's really just to kind of get us from one place to another, but while we get there, we're also going to learn kind of like at least a couple of things about cathedral and church building and architecture, and about the Romanesque and the Gothic, and about the continuity of the Basilica form, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So this answers the how do we get from here to here sort of question, and also how do we get from here to there kind of question. So and so the first thing I want to emphasize is that oftentimes when we look at this change from one world to the next, we think the end of the Roman Empire was the fundamental change, right? But actually, a lot of the changes that we see, a lot of the tendencies of medieval art begin in the Roman period, right? That already, if you're looking at the way that this is carved, there is a different aesthetic to the way this is carved compared to like Roman artwork from the beginning, from the Republic period, from the Augustinian period, or the early Empire period. And I think a lot of it has to do with clarity of communication, right? That by the time we get to the 4th century CE, into the 5th century, that the Roman Empire is focused on holding together, and it's focused on Christianity is one of those things that helps it hold together, and that's probably the main reason why Constantine chose it as a religion and allowed it to become a legal religion in the empire. And so also they wanted to make sure that their ideas were clearly communicated to the whole of the empire, to a very vast, very diverse group of people. And so the art changed in subtle ways, emphasizing immediacy and clarity. You could literally say that the artwork in some ways is becoming more cartoonish. Proportions are becoming, in that heads are becoming a little bit larger in relation to bodies, eyes are becoming larger in relation to heads. And for the same reason, really, because cartoons are the way they are because they communicate quickly and clearly, and because they have a tendency to kind of read universally. They're not bogged down in the super specific details. So we can kind of see those two things working here in this sarcophagus, right? Where we see both that into this early Christian art, there's a lot of adoption of Greek motifs, of like classical ideas of sculpture and of figure, of contrapposto poses and everything. But there's also this kind of starting kind of early Christian art aesthetic where the heads are a little bit larger, right? They're more like they're more simplified, and they're more exaggerated in facial details, kind of more deeply carved to kind of over exaggerate features, and for the purpose of making sure that the narrative, the stories, right, and therefore the theological ideas contained in those narratives are really clearly communicated. So that's now the other thing I wanted to say on this page that's important is, so besides this piece here, which I think really says so much about this kind of idea of continuity between the end of the Roman Empire into the early Christian art and into all the way through the medieval period. The other thing that speaks a lot about continuity is the basilica form. We will see that this format of architecture gets adopted. Originally, this was a format of architecture used by the Roman Empire for public buildings, primarily for buildings that served the same function as an agora did in Greek society, which is like a public meeting space. And this was a space where they used it essentially for courts and for the meeting of magistrates, a meeting of high government officials. Oftentimes, you'll read in places saying that the basilica form was basically the form that was used for public baths. And although that is true, that was not their primary purpose. And there are many examples of basilicas that didn't have public baths, and some where public baths were just a small part of it. But what they all had in common was the sense of being a meeting place, a public square, a public meeting place. And the early Christians adopted this form. And let's just talk for a second about why, because here's something that sometimes students have a misconception. When we look at ancient Greek and ancient Roman temples, we tend to view them the same way that we view our own worship, the way we go to church, right? So we think of like the Parthenon as a place that people would go to go inside and to worship. But actually, if you look at the floor plan of the Parthenon, you would realize that that's not at all what it was designed for. All worship happened, it related to the Parthenon, happened on, or almost all of it happened on the outside. All the public worship happened on the outside, on the steps, or on the altar that was set aside in front of the Parthenon. So public worships in the ancient world were generally done on the outsides of buildings, done in exterior spaces. The interior spaces of temples were reserved for the priestly class, the high priests, and the people who were responsible. Like in the case of the Parthenon, there were 3 maidens that were always chosen. That part of their job was to take care of the interior of the Parthenon temple. Not many people were allowed inside. But Christian worship was quite different. And hold on, because Christian worship was much different, where it required people to congregate together, right? The word congregation. Christians had been when they were in a legal religion, they'd been meeting in people's houses, meeting in various kind of secret meeting places, but communally meeting together, worshiping together, singing hymns together was always a major part of the Christian faith. And when Christianity became a legal religion and a somewhat publicly adopted religion, then it became much bigger, and so it needed bigger meeting spaces. So the basilica form becomes the logical sort of space for that, because it's designed for the meeting of large groups of people, right? So here's Saint Sabia on the interior, and it is such a gorgeous space. And you can really see from this, and when we get to looking at some of the early Romanesque churches, you can see that this is basically the structure. We have a center area, we have aisles along the side. At the end of it, we have where the altar would be, right? That eventually becomes what's called a transept, where there's aisles going in both directions, like a cross, but not yet. But this basic structure of a center worship space with then aisles with columns supporting in between the aisles and the center worship space becomes the standard. That basilica structure becomes a standard for hundreds of years. So I have about a minute left. So which more do I want to talk about? So we see the same sort of thing at a much grander scale, just 30 years later, the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, right? And then we get all the way to the very beginnings of the Romanesque, and we see the same principle, right? The beginnings is the idea of a transept, but which you can't see quite clearly in this image, except for the indication of it is the fact that we have these double arches right there around the altar, the backspace right there. But we have these aisles on either side of the main worship space. The other thing that's changing is the desire to go higher on the interior space, for the ceiling to go more upward, and that will start to become really important when we get to talking about the Gothic. Okay, I'm going to end there, and then next we'll be talking about the late